remember to buy a copy of your favorite books from the cheeky merchants. If we don't have it, we'll source it for you, but we'll definitely find the book for you.
Good afternoon, cheeky natives. Welcome to another episode of the Cheeky. Hey, Alma, how you doing, girl?
I'm well. I can't complain. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. I always look forward to cheeky native conversations for some reason. I suppose it means I get to geek over books with you. So it's quite exciting to think about our guest today. And I think that it may be our first kind of nonfiction. No, actually, no, we had Panashe Chukumadzi. So let's introduce our guest. Our guest this evening, Frank Thabani Sayi, was born in Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, in the late 1960s, on the cusp of a war of independence, or the Bush War, to overcome a century of racial subjugation. After Zimbabwe's independence from white rule, he bore witness to and survived the Gukurahundi massacres orchestrated by Robert Mugabe's militants in Matabaland in the early 1980s. He came to England on a scholarship and has worked as a nurse in cardiothoracic medicine, intensive care, and gender-affirming reassignment surgery, and for 25 years as a police officer in the child sexual exploitation, black-on-black violence and modern slavery and child criminalization exploitation, and most recently as a lecturer at the Open University in the law and business faculty. He holds a doctorate in English and humanities and a master's in culture and critical studies, both from Birkbeck University of London. Frank is also an associate editor of the Brief Encounters Journal at SOAS. His first short story, Shadows, was published in the Mechanics Institute Review of 2015. In his spare time, he enjoys long walks and exploring the beautiful Buckinghamshire countryside. Good afternoon and welcome. Welcome, Frank. Welcome to the Cheeky Natives.
Thank you for having us.
I suppose I wanted to speak about, the title was really striking for me, right? It was about no safer kind of hatred. And for me, when I encountered the title, I was like, okay, hold up. Safer, kinda, hatred. How is hatred kinda and safer? You know? So I wanted to speak a little bit about why it was important, why this specific title. And there is reference to it kind in the book, but if someone comes and picks up the book at the bookshelf, why this title?
I think the interesting thing about that title of the book came out towards the end of the book. I had never even thought about what I was going to call it at the beginning. It was only when I actually reread the book myself and I thought, well, what are we going to call this now? And then I started to think more deeply about what this story, if I could use the story, was about. It's this idea that, whites, particularly in the Zimbabwean and South African context, have kind of brutalized us as an attempt to civilize us, but also look after us. This idea of a very malevolent beneficence. And then that filters through into our private life, where I heard sometimes my grandmother would say something like, if a man doesn't love you, a man who doesn't love his wife, or a man who loves his wife, will beat him up just periodically. You have men that will just go out drinking and they come home and beat their wives up because that's how you show up your masculinity and your energy. So I was kind of thinking about this language, this architecture that allows for violence to happen, all in the name of kindness. We're trying to save you from yourself. We're doing this for your own good. So we're taking your land from you because you can't protect it. Because look, if we give it to you, you're going to just let it deteriorate, and we are here to protect the animals. All of these things that are done in the name of trying to protect us from ourselves. Yet at the same time, you're just brutalizing us, no end. So really, when you look at back what's happening and what's still happening now, both in Zimbabwe and in South African context, the past still prevails in the present. And we haven't really kind of figured out a way of dealing with it. So now we've kind of turned inward in the way of the internal strife, the internal violence, and everything else. So the title of the book came really from that kind of framework of trying to address these good intentions, if you like, that have been kind of manifest out there to try and save us from ourselves. But really, it's still brutality. You don't hurt me and tell me that it's for your own good. In the same way that adults would pick up a shoe, and work a child's backside because it's for their own good.
So Interestingly, in this book, I think you explore the theme of coming home often. So the theme of return that opens the book, but there's also the theme of coming or going somewhere, coming home to something towards the end of the book. And I'm interested in the theme of return because I think a lot about the concept of coming home to a place that really just feels unfamiliar, that has changed beyond recognition, right? So the places that we know, how does our return mark the ways in which we've changed? Now, I wanted to talk a lot about the theme of return and homecoming as an exploration of disconnect between self and memory, particularly in the context of displacement and war.
Yeah, that's important, isn't it? And I think we spend a lifetime kind of trying to run away from spaces where we feel violated, in a way. But the idea of home as a place where we were raised, a physical space. And then there's this home idea of home in me anywhere. What's me, what I carry by way of my culture, my language, and other things that have always served me in the way of what I'd call a reorienting reflex. You know, I've been in England now just under 40 years. I don't feel home at all, but it's a physical space that I'm in. You call it the Sayi, if I return to Africa now, I think it's going to take me another 10 years just to readjust, not just to the current climate, to readjust to the language of place. You know, that language evolves. And I was just saying earlier on that I went to South Africa in 2018, and I have upwards of something like 25 nephews and nieces now that were born in South Africa, South African citizens now, and they all speak between them the 11 or 12 languages and the variations thereof. And so you land in this space completely alienated, but also you're open to new experiences. And to me, this idea of violence and displacement, this idea of always going elsewhere because you think that's safer, because you think you'll be welcome there. Only to realize, of course, that, you know, there's this anti-Black sentiment everywhere you go in the world. And it has a way of coming back. I mean, we are going through that now in Europe, where you send them home. Here where I am, this redefinition of what it means to be British or what it means to be English, and how does one qualify in the forever shifting environment. And then when we go home, what I call home, people look at me in a different way and think, well, where have you been? You know, what do you know? And then for me, this idea of trying to grapple with language itself, because language evolves. And the experiences, so that the gap between me and the younger generation of Zimbabweans, they might be talking about farm invasions from 1990, I wasn't there. They might be talking about different forms of political violence, I wasn't there. So when I mention Gukurahundi, atrocities, some of them they don't know. It's something they read about, something that's totally irrelevant. But it's a continuing story of our fight for freedom that started nearly 100 years prior, because people always seem to think these things kind of jump and there's no link between each event, as if this event stands on its own, but it doesn't. So our language and our way of perceiving the world we're in and our idea of home now is different, because all of a sudden now we have homes all over the place that aren't really our homes but shelter. And for African people, particularly in Sub-Saharan Africa, this idea of a people that have land but no habitat. You know, when I was in South Africa, like I was just saying earlier, when I just kind of felt crushed and really, 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 really angry. Even on the flight there, I was sitting next to this Afrikaner guy and his wife, and that just wedged in between. And I was just trying to make small talk, like, hey, how are you? How are you doing? And it just wasn't forthcoming. It's just one of those things that just felt really totally unwelcome. And when I got to South Africa and I landed through the airport at the other end, there's also this thing about I couldn't read people, like facial expressions. I didn't know what the etiquette would be for me to say things and still say safe as somebody who's foreign, and bearing in mind what was going on then. So all of those things. And for me, this idea of a home as something that's always shifting, but also as a space that you carry with you. But a home also in the language you're couched in, how you express yourself, how you say things to people, how you have those conversations. Like, you know, and how many languages do you speak? You know, because it has a very, very huge impact on how you express yourself and how you are in the world. So let me give you an example. I think the South African psychologist Pumla Gobodo Matekizela, She was talking about this concept of 5 tongues in one mouth. So you speak 4, 5, 6 languages, of which a European language might be like your third, your fourth, your fifth language. And you're trying to express yourself in a way that makes you feel, okay, I'm saying something here that resonates with people at home. In the way that I write the book. And I would imagine that there are passages you said you read in there and you laughed because I didn't have to explain the context. Think that I know exactly what he's saying. So I mean, whereas like here, when I was talking to editors, the struggle was for them to kind of say, well, is this correct English? Is this syntactically correct, or is the grammar? And I was thinking, no, it's got nothing to do with any of those things. I have thought about the grammatical elements of what I'm saying, and the syntax is in place because I have studied your language and I'm quite fluent in it. But I'm just saying this in this other language that's couched in my experience, that has my idea of what it means to be home. So if I arrive, like I say at the beginning of the book, there was quite a few things that bothered me. I used to live in this high-rise building in Paddington in London. And I'm in there one day, and I had this compulsion to paint my room purple. Don't ask me why. So I ran from my room on the 14th floor, down the stairs, across the road, into this DIY shop, got purple paint and a brush, came back, and I painted my whole room purple. So I'm sitting there thinking that something is missing. Don't know what it is. So I go, okay. So off I went again back to the shop, and I bought this tin of white paint, came back, and I drew a big white cross on the wall, and I sat on my bed. So I'm looking at this thinking, and then it just occurred to me that something is wrong, dude. What is it? And I literally left my room, turned left on the corridor, and I called my mum. That's it, beginning of the book, when I'm making that phone call and saying what happened in that room on that corridor frightened me. So I didn't know what it was, and then the solution to me was living like, okay, sit here and try and understand it. It was book a ticket and go home. And it's that moment that know that there's a space that owns you and a place that you can call home when things go wrong.
Again, I think that really leads me to the second part of my question, right? Because I think we've spoken about returning home to a place that feels unfamiliar, but also around grief for finding a home. And I think it's so interesting that you've spoken about grief.
Yeah.
Because we think there are so many rituals in this book around loss, around death, and physical spaces, right? That is a central theme in the book. And we think a lot about how death and how grief is tied to a specific location. So in the book, your grandmother goes with you to a particular place and says, bring a rock, bring this, bring that. This is where we go. You go and this is so you're going to announce when you're going to leave. You go speak to your grandfather's grave and you tell him, I'm leaving, I'm going here, I'm going to do this. But I want to speak about how these rituals provide meaning and solace in the absence of having the physical connection to home. So how does grief find a home when you don't have a home for it to call?
I think what I can say to that is that this idea of spirit as a gift that we have, and you don't know, like I say in the book, that I didn't know that I was connected to this place, to these people, in the way that I was, and also that in African culture we're losing some of that now. That there is a process for dealing with these things, I think my grandmother knew why I was there, and she understood what she had to do. So the idea of grief finding a home is just based on this idea that now I was in a physical space where I could actually see my mum's been laid to rest. That's where she is. So I can, whether I'm talking to her loudly, whether I can sit in the African way of doing things, where you sit in that place next to her grave, and you're having your own conversation in your own head about what's going on, saying your goodbyes, and also your regrets, as in I think she was ill for quite some time, but she never kind of openly told me that that's what the case was. And I was young, doing my own thing in London. So the idea of really physically going home in a space and a place that doesn't feel like home, because when I left Zimbabwe, I was really, really angry, and I thought that I would never go back. It was just one of those things that I just thought in my head that there's a group of grown men who sat down somewhere, someplace, and decided that they wanted to eliminate my kind, and to have gone through that and be on the other side and try and understand as you grow up this idea of not just neglect, but also this sense of betrayal. And also, I wasn't quite sure about whether I'll be able to kind of hold it together and not say something to someone and end up with the consequences of that. So to me, carrying my brief home, even though that wasn't home in the sense, was this idea that, okay, I live in a foreign country. I have no connection to the land per se. Like in Africa, when you're born, particularly in Ndebele culture or in Zulu culture, where your umbilical cord is buried where you're born. So as a way of registering your arrival in the world, and also as a way of registering this connection that your mother has with the earth, and also that wherever it is you go in the world, you're grounded, that's your home. So my grandmother's home was like that place where if I had any weight on my shoulders that I couldn't get rid of anywhere else, that was the space. Just my being physically in that space and connected spiritually onto the ground and knowing that, okay, I've arrived, and all of a sudden everything made sense, if that makes sense, in a way. And I needed to go there again because I hadn't spoken to anyone about what had happened. And I was in a different area of where my grandmother was when the Gukurahundi thing happened. And I just happened to come to England in my really late teens, and I had never thought about any of that. So it was a multiplicity of things that kind of collided when everything was about to kind of go haywire, as you know. And you think, okay, it's that moment of reckoning, as in, I'm going to keep quiet in all the languages I know and just listen. Before I forget this idea of the centrality of women in this story, and what they've kind of done in a way to keep families together, to hold it together, to rise over and above this idea of a really brutal system that kind of shows us violence every day. And at least home was this sanctuary. And the warmth of the home wasn't provided by men. Even as they claim that they protect women, they don't. The men just took the guns and they went. And it was the women that bore the whole, the brunt of the war from both ends. So when I came home, again, my reception was by women. My grandmother, the font of all knowledge. So home, for me, is this idea of my grandmother and the women who raised me. And so, yeah, I felt I could go there and just lay to the ground, and then maybe everything will be all right.
I wanted to speak firstly about the perpetual infantilization of Black people, right? As we spoke about, this memoir critiques that systemic treatment of Black people as perpetual subordinates or as incapable because of the legacy of colonialism. But also connected to that is kind of Black participation in systems of violence. The narrative that examines the role of Black individuals within oppressive systems. I recall particularly one striking thing is, the encounter of the Black policeman at this scene where your grandmother is pleading with this white, literally talking to this Black man to say, what have you done to this child, right? So it kind of highlights the complexity of complicity, but also the complexity of survival. And I wanted to speak about that, right? Like you explore quite greatly how this legacy of colonialism leaves Black people as perpetually infantile. And then the other thing is the participation of Black people in the systems of oppression. So they kind of are furthering white supremacy, one as an act of survival, but also we see it as complicity. And I wanted to speak a little bit about that.
We're taking a short break. We're taking a short break.
Yeah, I'll start with the first part of the question, which is this continuous kind of infantilization of Black people, as though we are incapable. So if you think about, this idea of white man's burden, or why they came to Africa in the first place, to save, I'm going to use Black men here to represent the whole collective humanity of Black Africans. So we were an uncivilized people who were required, who in essence, who really kind of asked Europeans to come in and help us. But what they're doing really is using violence to take our land, to displace us, to commit heinous crimes. Because once they could frame this idea of their they want to civilize the natives. It didn't care. They didn't care really, or it didn't matter what kind of methodology they use, because it's almost out of sight, out of mind. So, and you can see these tools, the independence of Zimbabwe particularly, where the narrative shifts. No one is no longer talking about black freedom or the freedom of blacks. Everyone is talking about what happens to white farmers, what happens to whites. So the whole discussion in Lancaster House, a very, very interesting actually location. If you think about this, that you are discussing the freedom of your people from people who are oppressing them, and then you go to the oppressor's place of origin to discuss that freedom. And how could that be? I mean, our kings would never go leave the crow and go elsewhere to discuss their freedom. They just would never done that. So the whole thing was skewed from the outset. It was, if you read historical narratives now, it was just designed to really give the whites an upper hand, and also to make sure that they walked away with everything they'd worked for. And also a safe passage, one. And B, that they could walk away with impunity and never have to apologize to anyone, about what they did. So in South Africa, you've had the opportunity under the TRC to try and kind of uncover some of those things and kind of discuss it. But, that's another narrative for a different day. My take on it is, we as black people knew what whites were doing. We didn't need some kind of open forum to discuss the violence that was visited to us by white people, one. And B, we were never paid, This is the one thing that everyone just talks about, white land is and white land. And in Zimbabwe, there's this coin or this phrase they've coined now, it's called white-owned land. And when I saw that, I just thought, what a misnomer. How do you come to a black country on the African continent and call black people's land white-owned land? And what kind of concept is that? And what does it do? Because then it justifies all kinds of things in the background. So now the Zimbabwean government has agreed to pay £4.5 billion back to white farmers for the land that was taken from them. And think about that for a moment, that the whole struggle for independence was for us to have our land back from our oppressors. We were just told. It's almost like on the 17th of April, 1980, we were oppressed. And then on the 18th, we just told, yeah, you're free. We didn't even get our 12 acres of land and the mule. It was like, yeah, you're free. Free to do what? And where? So there was no transfer of wealth. There was no structural transfer of violence. So the state, Robert Mugabe and his friend, they inherited the structure that was laid by Ian Smith. His laws, his jails, detention centers, torture chambers, the infrastructure itself. Even the man who worked for Ian Smith shifted sides and they worked for Robert Mugabe. And I need to point this out to you, South Africans, that a huge contingent of white Rhodesian soldiers, particularly ex-Special Forces people, crossed the border and they joined South African Defence Force. So you can see that transfer of violence across the borders now, what I call the technique, that they've learned how to deal with natives, how to cover their traces, and how to make it look as though we're the beasts that really demand to be treated this way. That's the first thing. But also now, whenever I hear an argument about what's going on in Zimbabwe, it's like, oh, look how they lay to waste the farms, and how, if whites were here, this could never have happened. This idea of a pre-lapsarian Zimbabwe, where Zimbabwe was the breadbasket of Africa, and we all lived in Eden until, we ate the apple. But we didn't. We didn't. Like, if you know the geography of Zimbabwe and the place that I grew up in, it's still rubble. It's still dry. My grandmother's land is that. They never got another acre of whatever it is. We still have what we had. We were never given a penny to sort of say, now that you're free, here's something to start you off. So to me, this idea that this whole thing was always about money, was always about land, was always about, you cannot emancipate people who spent 100 years fighting oppression without education. My grandmother couldn't walk into a bank and say, could you lend me 2 million rand, please, so I can buy a tractor for my farm. And they didn't have capacity to do that. They didn't even have bank accounts. So the misunderstanding or the lack of knowledge is now racialized in a way, as in, okay, it's personified as in what do you expect from black people. But it's not us. It's just the fact that we were never taught to think that we could start businesses that we could employ other people, that we could create business opportunities. What you don't see doesn't validate your existence. No, it's the same thing that's happening in South Africa now. Lema and his ilk are running around saying, "No, claim the land, wherever you want." But the laws of the land say, "No, if you go and occupy the land that's owned by somebody on paper, you are trespassing." And the law is always behind who owns the land. But you guys as well were never paid. You're never paid. It's not because South Africans are stupid or that they can't work out how the world works. It's just because you were never paid. If you look at some of the areas where, not just in Zimbabwe, in South Africa and in Kenya, all post-colonial colonies so-called, people live in slums, the infrastructure that was there. And because there was no investment in terms of money, and you can add on top of that corruption. And also one thing that people keep forgetting, Rhodesia was never a democratic country. It was an illegal racist regime. So you can't possibly say that people were free then and that, if we were here, if we were in charge. So to me, those questions are redundant. We don't need white people to thrive. All they could have done to help us is just leave us alone and give us money and invest and give us back what they stole from us. In the same way now that there's this argument now in South Africa about the genocide, the white genocide. The Afrikaners now are being threatened by, and you look at the statistics, the number of farmers who get killed compared to the number of black people, or if you need to break it down, the number of black women who get slaughtered every day in South Africa. There's just no comparison, right? But they're trying to make it sound as though, whites now are, yesterday's victimizers, today's victims. And I always pay attention to instances where it's almost like this kind of rehabilitation of whiteness. It's no longer what it used to be. It's not as dangerous as it used to be. And now it kind of calls for and, requires care and, understanding and all of those things. And so we're going back now. And the back of that, you have the enforcement of sanctions. You have things that are going on in the world. In the case of Zimbabwe, the International Monetary Fund, the so-called Structural Adjustment Program, the World Bank, the United Nations, they all withdrew all that help from Zimbabweans and let them out to dry, all under the pretext that, they're trying to stop the racist regime of Robert Mugabe taking farms from whites. But what's interesting for me now is that white Zimbabweans are now coming home after 30 years in exile. They can't fit in here. They can't get their nannies here. They can't sit their sundowners in the evening and have their barbecues without people that they pay pittance to do those things for them. So they are going back home, in brackets, because that's where that's going to continue, because they figured out that the colonies oppress as long as we don't understand how the world works and how finance works and how we can create business opportunities. So to me, this idea that we need to be constantly chaperoned, that we almost need this malevolent beneficence from white farmers who has the skill to farm the land, when all that required really is for African governments to select our brightest, send them to Europe or send them to China, or wherever it is, to learn agriculture and come home and take over those and give them the money to farm. We've always fed ourselves. We've always looked after ourselves in the Bantustans, in the reserves, in the townships. So survival was nothing new to us. We survive in spite of and despite of white supremacy. So I think it's very cheeky for people to actually say that we need them to come and hold our hands, in spite of everything that they've done. Our participation in a collective complicity in white supremacy, and this idea that one, it was a survival thing, and B, for me, it was almost like power, because even as a kid, I could see who had power. If a man has a gun and they come to your home and they can do what they want with whom they want, you grow up with this mindset that, I want that kind of power, but that's not even power in a positive way. That's just tyranny. And I think there are black people that are addicted to that, who are going to get given the power, and they terrorize people. I don't think, even in the absence of white structures of violence, which we inherited, by the way, they're still in place, there is room for us to kind of think about what police officers are supposed to do in Zimbabwe to protect black Africans or black women particularly. We haven't come up with this notion that police officers work for us, and they think it's the other way around. We're there to service their needs and that they were there. So this idea of predation by people in power and people that have guns has never gone, because it's an alien structure that we inherited, and we haven't kind of figured out how to go back a little bit and then reintroduce this idea of African jurisprudence. I'll unpack that in a minute. This idea that Ubuntu, which is I think, being hijacked now by corporate companies, but the idea that I'm talking about isn't that. So Ubuntu, as you and I understand it, this idea, the philosophy, the conceptual framework that organizes how we relate to each other, whether you're a man, whether I'm a woman, or whether you're my neighbor, is something that we need now, so that we kind of reassess our humanity and go back, take a step back. This idea for me of Ubuntu that I saw when I was growing up, in the middle of that brutality, was this idea that you're one of us and we are one of you. So it's almost like we cannot let you hurt yourself, because if we let you hurt yourself like that, pretty soon whatever it is you do is going to come back to haunt us. This idea by Russian literary giants like Solzhenitsyn, that if you live your pathological life, you pathologize people around you. And the clearest idea I can use to substantiate this idea is HIV and AIDS, where we knew, or people know, that they're infected, but they still go out and do something, go and get drunk and sleep with someone and spread it. In the same way with violence, we see a next door neighbor being violent, and then we go out and we lynch them and do it. So this whole thing that perpetuates all of these bad things. And then circling back to this idea of the colonial system and how it really brutalized this, in the sense that white soldiers had access to limitless violence to protect white women and children at the expense of the black family. So it didn't matter that the white soldier would terrorize us and my grandmother and women like her who were helpless at home, without any man, without an understanding of the language of the rules and the regulations in the way of how we're being dealt with. And I think black men, black people caught on to that. We've inherited it. Our military does that. But we are the only continent on Africa where the military terrorizes us. I've never ever seen soldiers in this country, British soldiers that are trained by the state here, knocking down our doors or coming.
So I actually wanted to speak a little bit about a theme that I think you explored earlier, and that's the theme of family. And why I think it's so important is because the family itself as a structure is very political. So you speak in the book about being a child who belongs to no one. And when you think about the fundamental units of family, I think a lot about the themes of abandonments that run throughout the book and the struggle to find a sense of belonging in a fractured family. But then I want to contrast that with what Bell Hooks said about love and abuse, and how love cannot exist in abuse, right? Or in abusive situations. And so I want to speak to the intersection of love and abuse and the dynamics that then shape the family.
Okay, I mean, this is a very, very important question, because for me, it's like, as I said before, the structural violence that was inflicted on everyday people by the state. So the military has got infrastructure. They almost have a monopoly, whether it's a police officers, whether it's the CIO officers, whether it's undercover officers, or whoever else got a gun and they can do what they want to do to people at night. That filters through, because if you were a man, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to trivialize the violence against women. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But if you are a man, and the way I was raised, you are the protector of your wife and your kids. If somebody's at the door knocking, dogs are barking, you're the one that's supposed to go and have a look. You don't say to your wife or your daughter, can you just go and have a look who's outside? Because you already, the way I was raised was, you're already anticipating that something might happen. So you go there and have a look. And then all of a sudden now you have a bunch of young men who, because they have guns on them, can come and do as they please, not just to your wife, but to your daughters, and you can't protect them. This idea, it's not idea, and this thing that I saw, people like my father and his brothers and everyone else that I thought were really tough, hard men, right? The idea of me even saying anything, but they were not. They were not, because they were just cowards. And when I saw what happened to them, this idea that they could just be violated because they were so afraid they're going to die anyway. There's very few of them that, to me, died fighting, as in, okay, we're not doing this, and if you're going to do this, you might as well shoot me. But they were beaten to a pulp in front of us. And they're so completely emasculated. And I think what that does for men is like this kudos of, I'm the strongest man there is and I have power over everyone else. It's suddenly gone. And then, you can't then go and impose your will on your sons, particularly see this, or on your wife if you haven't defended her. It kind of erodes that whole fabric that holds the family unit together. So it's almost like each one man or each woman for themselves now. And then it filters through. For you to reassert your authority now, you have to be violent. For most men, that's what they think the solution is. So, okay, for me to reassert my manly authority in this household, I'm going to show you this is what I can do because of what's happened in front of you, and you think I can't do the same. And then the boys grow up learning that, or understanding because their heads that if I want to assert my authority, if I want to be seen, to be heard, I have to be violent. And then the women beat up the children, and then the older sibling kicks the younger siblings, and the dog bites the cat. And then you are in a situation where everyone understands and believes in violence. And I see this all the time. When you talk to people and they say, oh, I could have killed him. Right? Violence is always at hand, comes in handy, and we all kind of subscribe to when it suits us. And I think that's the thing I'm trying to get at here, that each and every person that I've ever come across, when you are angry, in that moment when you're angry, where you can't manage your anger, there's a point at which you think, so what happens beyond this moment of madness? That rupture between your coherent, rational self to, okay, now I'm going to do this. And I don't think, even like having worked as a police officer, there are times when I was interviewing people who have done really horrible things, and you ask them, what happened between this point here and this? They can't tell you. And they were stuck in most cases, and I was just thinking, either they're just hiding something or they're being ignorant. Then you realize that it completely went blank the minute they decided to pick up a knife to the moment when they stopped doing what they're doing, or when they got arrested, or somebody pinned them to the ground, that kind of thing. And I think for me, particularly in our communities back home on the African continent, I see this now. It's a recurring theme. I was going to talk about this idea that Winnie Mandela said that with matchboxes and petrol, we are going to liberate this country. I don't think she could have realized the significance of what she was saying at the time. And I'm not saying this because she is a woman. I'm only saying it because there's a double bind to what she said. She said this because she really understood that if you want to be a true revolutionary, which what women aren't allowed. So it's almost like the revolutionary is Mandela, who talks softly and he can exercise violence through other people. But when you have a very directly confrontational woman that's saying, we are going to liberate this country with our matchboxes and tires and petrol and whatnot, and then that carries through now into the township. It becomes a way of resolving conflict. It becomes a way of dealing with the other that's never going to go. And we don't even know when or how it started or started it. But for me, it's all of those things that you kind of think, I've seen it all, but then again, it's kind of repeating itself and it's coming back again. And, like in South Africa, and I'm sure in Zimbabwe as well now, you have a huge problem around gender-based violence. Here they call it domestic violence. I don't understand why the misnomer domestic. There's nothing domestic about violence, but that's what they call it as a working term, right? So the death of the two cousins, I think it's last week or week before, who got shot by a bouncer because he felt entitled. The farmer who kills women that were looking for dairy products up, he didn't even care, but he was going to feed them to pigs. And then he shoots the women, and then the audacity to actually feed them to pigs to get rid of the body. So it's all of those things for me that kind of form this intricate web of violence that stems from the displacement of people from their families, this idea of the family unit as the place where charity resides, the place where we learn our humanity, the place where you think, if I'm feeling unsafe, I'm going to go home. But for most of us, home is no longer safe. If anything's going to happen to you, if you're a child on the continent, is at home. Is at home. If it's not at home, it was at school for us. And I'm sure that same thing still happens now, where there's this level of violence against school children and by teachers, and this idea of predation, where grown men take advantage of young girls and vice versa, because the family has been destroyed in a way, in a very kind of sustained way, and we've never been able to recover from that.
I wanted to speak a little bit about the limitation of language. I think
Yeah.
that one of the strengths of the book is I kept having to ask myself that you're retelling the story in English, but I suppose up until a point it wouldn't have been in English. So it feels like the memories, the texture of the story is in Ndebele, because
Yeah.
the limitation of language is, for me, English as a language of violence and colonization, I think is
Mm.
critiqued in the book for its inability to fully capture the experience and the emotions of Black communities, right? And I think what you do powerfully is emphasize the kind of limitation of the white man's language. And I wanted to speak a little about that, why it was important for you to constantly come back to the theme of the limitation of English and not the limitation of language per se, but the limitation of the English language as this language of violence and colonization.
Because my grapple with the whole theme of language for me was first, the displacement was followed by this idea that we could only ever express ourselves, intelligently if we use the colonizer's language. And I think I allude to this in the book, where we were not allowed to express ourselves in our local language, because the idea was, you're going to learn this language and speak it, and the violence from the teachers that went into trying to enforce this rule. And for me, the limitations then came with this idea that, okay, you've done all of these things to us. How do we find a way of telling a story? And I don't like to use the word story. I guess of kind of a narrative that goes under the language, in the language itself, and subverts the language in a way that if an English person trying to write the same narrative, it won't sound the same. And there's also this idea of the multiple languages that I use, that I speak, and I speak 4 or 5 languages now. How they contest for space, particularly in the post-colonial environment, where they contest for space and for voice, in trying to highlight the brutality of the system, using their own language thrown at it, but also wanted to make sure that if a boy from Zimbabwe, a girl from Zimbabwe, or girl from South Africa, or on the African continent, in some place affected by war, they can read that story and understand. And I use the word story carefully here. We're always told this idea of don't go around telling stories now, right? Which means as kids, you knew that when you're speaking truth, you're telling a story, aren't you? So don't go around telling stories, or told tales, as they called it. There's a South African psychologist, and what his name is now, Mangani, and he came up with this concept of a truth deemed possible. So that's what that is. But for me, I'm trying to wrestle with the language to make it say what I want it to say in a way that makes sense to us as a people, in the way we tell our stories. Because our language is very oral. It's not the writing of Ndebele and Zulu came afterwards. But storytelling has always been a core component of who we are. So it's I'm relating a tale, I'm telling a story, but also at the same time, I'm trying to use language in a way that portrays the gravity of what I'm talking about, without getting too serious on itself. And also I'm being mindful of that, this idea of being pompous and writing in an English that becomes impenetrable and it gets in the way of the story. And also I intentionally sought out to include women's voices in there. And not even just include them, but to use them as a platform to showcase what was done to us as a people. Because very rarely do you see stories that are written by men that are about women in their life, or the important people in their life that happen to be women. So I wanted to use my grandmother's voice as a philosophical basis for, and the critique for the system. And I could use the little boy's voice as the naive little boy that's just following his grandmother around by learning and also being confused. And some of those confusions were real, because I was asking, my grandmother was telling me that, I was talking about prostitutes. So how do I know a woman's a prostitute? And what is a prostitute? Right. And because you're trying to learn as a boy to understand this difference between good women and bad women. And how do you negotiate that terrain in a language that's already loaded with judgment? And also, so when you come to a war zone where women haven't got, it's even harder still for me to talk about. When I talk about those girls that have been taken away by soldiers, this idea that, some of the girls fell in love with soldiers. I like looking back now, obviously with hindsight, it's a great thing. How do you consent to your own violation in a war zone just because somebody's given you a pack of crisps, or they're giving you money for sanitary powers that you need as a basic thing as a human being to look after yourself. So that the economy of the war zone where women have had to exchange their bodies so they can survive. But we never kind of try and talk about the whole issue around consent. What do you consent to in that environment? And also talk about the little boy and this soldier that keeps coming back every time he goes away, and he comes back and he fetches him. And they go. Oftentimes, adults don't really worry about what happens between little boys and men because boys don't get pregnant. And also, I think conceptually on the African continent, if a boy is with young older men, he's okay. Nobody thought beyond that, is there anything going on here? How do we talk to the boys about, or, the danger of what are these men doing to you? What were you talking about? But in the scale of all of those things going on, you as a child are on your own, or so it felt to me anyway, that the adult world is really, really powerless. So you couldn't go to a grown-up and say, this is what's going on. And what were they going to do? Absolutely nothing. So for me, this thing, the language and the way I use it, I'm trying to use not just only visceral language, but to employ language in a way that makes you follow the story and the twists and the turns. But also it's riddled with the local idioms and vernacular. And also where I'm being funny, but if you look at the metaphor, what I'm talking about. So there's a scene where me and my friend are going to school, and some boy had put like a ball in the middle of the road, and we thought it's a plastic ball football, but it's a stone. So you kick it full force, right? So you go to the nurse and you're expecting her to say, oh, what happened to you? And then the way I would hear as a nurse, here's a sweet look away. No, it wasn't like that at all. She was absolutely brutal, but because that's where we were. But if I was to try and explain to you that as a metaphor, like, in Ndebele we say, ukubega, right? It means either A, very angry, or I'm disappointed about something, but there's also this level of pain that goes with it. So when I use that metaphor, when you know what it feels like to kick a stone, even if it's inadvertent because you're walking barefoot, you've never had shoes in your life, right? So you kick this stone and the pain that comes back in. So as the idea of heartbreak or heartache or this other pain that you could really, really explain. So the language that I use in the book is distilled from so many fronts. And it's almost like a coalition of these different expressions and idioms. And it's distilled in a way that captures the local scene, if you like, in a way that's anti-European, that insists on, even though it's an English language that I'm using, but it's also this idea of an English infused with Africanity in it.
So, Frank, thank you for really what has just been such an insightful and powerful conversation. I guess our last question to you before we go is, what do you hope that this book will do now that it's out there, now that you've published it, now that it's being reviewed? What are your hopes for this book?
I think, given where we are in our history as a people, South Africa has not long kind of attained its independence. I think 35 years is nothing in terms of the work that needs to be done. And also for me now, the kind of silent and also belligerent return of white supremacy. And again, this kind of ongoing project to try and decolonize language and trying to use a particular form of idiom or expression. And not just that, and I feel like now, when I was writing the book, there were moments where it kind of felt like I was being corrected, yes, you can say this, but can you not use this phrase? And then you kind of try and follow that trajectory of thought as okay, I can't say this because it's making people uncomfortable. And B, this idea of people being triggered now, and that I always look at it from this point of view of, okay, so who is being triggered and why? So these are people that have gone over there and done horrible things. And now that we're telling the world what's been done to us, it's almost like we're turning down the language. We don't want to have to read about this because, in essence, it's triggering people and, no one's going to be interested in the narrative. But for me, the book, I hope, if it does anything, is this constant reminder that we were not just the palm trees and the rivers and, the background to white stories that are told about Africa without us. It's a book that kind of answers back to that colonial narrative, to the books that are being written by white Zimbabweans, what I call protest or grievous literature. In Zimbabwe, they called it when we were in Rhodesia. We've got now this idea of Rhodesians, were white, and that narrative of the country was better when white people were around still sustains. And I think hopefully if the book does anything at all, is to constantly question that narrative, to constantly challenge it, and also to tell, young Black boys and girls that there's a possibility for salvation and that there's always hope. Because if we lose hope as a people, we are done for. To always scope the horizon for good things, to always try and turn what might be a really, really bad situation in something positive. And also for me, I hope people use that book to learn that, you can come from a brutalizing or a damaging landscape and choose to do the right thing. It's not something that comes naturally. You have to work at it. You have to work all the time in terms of how, as a man, I see women, how I relate to my nieces, and how I talk to my nephews about certain things, how I express myself, all of those things, which is an ongoing project to create the new man and the new woman that's going to have a different vision. And also for me, I think some of the things that are going on in the world now aren't our problems. We have to go back to basics and revoke this whole idea of Ubuntu that's completely different, and how Black men and women and people of different sexualities can collaborate and create the weird world we live in. And that can only happen if we're hopeful. And I think that's why I end the book the way it does. The little boy is kind of scoping the horizon and thinking, whatever's happened here, I'm walking away, but something's going to happen. I can't remember who's wrote this book, and it's called What We Leave, We Carry. So it's this kind of this burden that we have of an unexplained, unpacked history that still has an impact on us. If anything that book does, I think it aims to explain the brutality of white supremacy and what it's done to us, the ongoing fight for our freedom as a people, because that's not come to an end, and also the idea that, it's going to take us time, but as long as we understand what this is, and where it's come from, where we inherited it, and, teach our men that there's a different way we can relate to our women. And also that being a man and being hard don't necessarily mean you have to terrorize people. So that's what I hope for. But the biggest thing for me is just the hope of the book. I mean, if it does anything, if it sticks around for a few years from now and somebody has a copy, and every so often it comes up and it's a story of us, told by us, in our own language in a way.
Thank you so much for an insightful conversation. Cheeky Natives, we hope that you will pick up a copy of No Safer Kind of Hatred by Frank Thabani Sayi, because it's really important for us to talk about our history. And as Frank said, our history told by ourselves. So we're really grateful. Thank you, Frank, for writing, but more importantly, for giving us insight into some of the themes that the book covers. We really hope that the book, as you say, will be picked up by young Zimbabweans or even older Zimbabweans who have a memory of the independence war or the Gukurahundi massacres and find that they can see themselves in the story. Thank you very much for writing, but more importantly, for this conversation.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, Cheeky Natives. Till next time, we're outie.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Cheeky Natives. Don't forget to subscribe, review, and rate the podcast on all your streaming platforms.